I was kneeling in the dirt, my lungs burning with the metallic taste of cold mountain air, while a single beam of light cut through the canvas of my tent like a blade. I did not breathe. I could not breathe. Outside, the sound of rhythmic, wet stepping circled my thin nylon shelter, and a low, frantic whispering began to vibrate through the fabric, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone, but filled with a jagged, human urgency. I gripped the handle of my hunting knife until the crossguard bit into my palm, knowing that if I moved, if I even let my heart beat too loudly, the thin wall between me and the shifting shadows would finally vanish. If you feel the shadows in your room are shifting as you listen, or if the silence of the night suddenly feels a little too heavy, consider subscribing for more tales. It might be the only company you have left in the dark. The Pacific Crest Trail is not just a path. It is a world of its own, a ribbon of dirt and rock that stretches from the dusty heat of the Mexican border to the jagged, ice-crowned peaks of Canada. When I set out that summer, fresh from graduation and fueled by a reckless sense of immortality, I thought I understood the wilderness. I thought the dangers were simple, things like rattlesnakes hidden in the scrub, the slow burn of dehydration, or the heavy, muscular presence of a black bear in the brush. I was prepared for nature to be indifferent, but I was not prepared for it to be hostile. By the time I reached the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, the isolation had begun to settle into my marrow. In the deep woods, silence is never truly silent. It is a physical weight, a ringing in the ears that makes you hear things that are not there, or worse, things that are. I had gone days without seeing another human soul. The trail was a lonely corridor of ancient pines and volcanic rock, where the only movement was the flicker of a lizard or the swaying of a branch in the high, thin wind. I remember the afternoon the air changed. It was unseasonably hot, the kind of heat that feels like a wet wool blanket draped over your shoulders. I rounded a sharp bend in the trail, my boots crunching on the volcanic scree, and stopped dead. There, sitting on a flat gray rock just a few feet away, were two figures. They were dressed entirely in white, but it was a white that had been reclaimed by the earth, stained with streaks of orange clay and the gray soot of old campfires. The man had a beard that hung in tangled, oily mats down to his chest, and his eyes were two dark pits set into a face that looked like cracked leather. The woman beside him was equally disheveled, her hair a wild halo of graying straw. They did not move as I approached. They did not even blink. They simply watched me with a flat, predatory intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I offered a tentative greeting, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the vast expanse of the forest, but they offered nothing in return. No nod, no wave, not even a shift in their posture. I felt their gaze like a physical touch on my back as I hurried past, the back of my neck prickling with an instinctual dread I could not explain. I hiked faster that day, pushing my pace until my thighs throbbed and my breath came in ragged gasps. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that silent, ghostly couple. When the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor, I veered off the trail. I found a spot several hundred yards into the thicket, a small clearing hidden by a dense stand of fir trees. I followed my usual routine, a series of mechanical actions designed to keep the mind occupied and the body safe. I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated beans, the steam rising in the cooling air, and then I carefully gathered the leftovers. I knew the rules of the woods. I found a sturdy branch about 20 feet from my tent and hung my food bag 5 feet off the ground using a length of nylon cord. I checked the knot twice. the rough texture of the rope scratching my fingers, and then I crawled into my sleeping bag. That night, the forest was unusually still. There was no wind to rustle the needles, no distant call of an owl, just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. When I woke the next morning, the forest was bathed in the pale, watery light of dawn. I unzipped my tent, the sound of the plastic teeth gnashing together feeling like a roar in the quiet air. I walked toward the tree where I had hung my food, expecting to see the familiar shape of the bag dangling from the branch. It was gone. The cord had not been chewed through by a squirrel or snapped by the weight of a bear. It had been cleanly cut. I knelt in the damp pine needles, my stomach dropping. There, in the soft earth beneath the branch, were the marks of boots. They were not the heavy, aggressive treads of hiking boots, but the flat, worn impressions of something lighter, something more domestic. There were 2 distinct sets of prints, circling the spot where my food had been. One set of tracks led directly to the base of the tree. Looking up, I saw the scuff marks on the bark where someone had climbed. My pulse began to thud in my throat. This was not the work of an animal. This was deliberate. This was a theft. I thought of the couple in white, their silent, unblinking stares, and a cold shiver washed over me despite the morning sun. I packed my gear with trembling hands, my movements frantic and clumsy. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to move. I kept telling myself that they were just hungry, that they were scavengers who had seen an easy meal. If they had wanted to hurt me, they would have done it while I slept. That logic felt thin, like a piece of worn silk ready to tear, but I clung to it. I hiked for 10 hours that day, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Every snap of a twig made me whirl around. Every movement in the periphery of my vision became a figure in white. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees leaning over the trail as if to listen to my frantic footsteps. By the time the light began to fail again, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I found a new campsite, even further from the trail than the night before. I was paranoid now. I gathered dry branches and dead wood, laying them in a wide, erratic circle around my tent. If anyone approached, the snap of a breaking stick would be my alarm. I crawled into my tent and gripped my knife, the cold steel a small comfort against the encroaching dark. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the rhythm of the wilderness. And then, just as my eyes were beginning to heavy with sleep, I heard it, the unmistakable, sharp crack of a dry branch breaking just outside my circle. I lay perfectly still, my fingers locked around the hilt of my knife so tightly that my knuckles felt like they might burst through the skin. The snap of the branch had been clean and deliberate, a sharp punctuation mark in the heavy silence of the mountain night. It was not the clumsy stumble of a deer or the heavy, rolling footfall of a bear. It was the sound of a weight being shifted with caution, a foot finding a solid anchor on a piece of deadwood. I waited for a second sound, a follow-up movement that would betray the intruder's position, but the forest fell into a suffocating, artificial quiet. The air inside the tent felt thick and used, smelling of my own salt and the dry synthetic scent of the nylon. Every time I inhaled, the fabric of the tent seemed to pulse inward, mirroring the frantic rhythm of my heart. I strained to hear through the thin barrier, my ears ringing from the intensity of the effort. Minutes passed, each one stretching out like a slow drip of tar, until I began to wonder if my mind had fabricated the sound out of sheer raw exhaustion. Perhaps the wood had simply settled. Perhaps the cooling temperature had caused a branch to contract and snap on its own. Then the sound returned. It was a low, rhythmic friction, the sound of something soft and fibrous rubbing against the outer fly of my tent. It was the sound of a hand. I could feel the vibration of it, a gentle, exploratory dragging of fingertips across the rainfly, moving from the top of the tent down toward the zipper. It was slow, almost affectionate, like a parent checking on a sleeping child. My skin crawled with a cold, visceral revulsion. I could visualize the person on the other side of that thin layer of gray fabric, their face inches away from mine, separated only by a fraction of an inch of plastic and mesh. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I knew that if I made a sound, the interaction would change. The predatory curiosity of the person outside would turn into something more direct. The dragging sound stopped near the entrance, and for a long time, there was only the sound of the forest. Then, a voice drifted through the fabric. It was a whisper, so low and raspy that it sounded more like a breeze caught in the throat of a cave. It was the woman. She wasn't speaking to me, but to herself, or perhaps to the man. She was humming a melody that had no beginning and no end, a tuneless, repetitive drone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I heard the man's voice then, a deep, gravelly murmur that vibrated through the ground beneath my sleeping pad. He spoke in short, jagged bursts of sound, none of which formed coherent words I could understand. It was a language of clicks and guttural stops, filled with a strange, frantic energy. They stayed there for what felt like hours, circling the tent with the patience of vultures. I could hear their footsteps now, soft and rhythmic, the sound of flat-soled shoes pressing into the pine needles and the volcanic dust. They were walking in a slow, clockwise circle, their presence a physical pressure against the walls of my sanctuary. Finally, the sounds began to recede. The humming grew fainter, and the footsteps moved away toward the dense thicket of fir trees to the north. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat upright, my back against my pack, my eyes fixed on the silhouette of the tent door. When the first gray light of morning finally began to bleed through the fabric, I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, hard certainty. I was being hunted. I broke camp in a state of controlled panic. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack with trembling hands, the nylon crinkling like thunder in the morning air. I didn't even look for the sticks I had laid out. I knew they would be moved or crushed. I stepped out of the tent and immediately looked at the ground. The circle of sticks I had placed around the tent was still there, but it had been altered. The branches had been picked up and rearranged. They were now pointed inward, like a series of arrows all converging on the spot where I had been sleeping. And in the center of the circle, right next to the tent peg, was a small pile of white stones. They were polished and smooth, looking like bleached teeth against the dark mountain soil. I didn't wait. I shouldered my pack, the weight of it digging into my sore shoulders, and began to run. I didn't head back to the trail immediately. I crashed through the brush, ignoring the branches that whipped across my face and the roots that threatened to trip me. I needed to be unpredictable. I needed to lose them in the vertical labyrinth of the forest. The terrain in this part of the Lassen Forest is brutal. It is a land formed by fire, filled with jagged lava tubes, steep ridges of loose scree, and dense stands of timber that haven't seen a human being in decades. I climbed a steep ridge, my boots slipping on the loose rock, the sound of my own heavy breathing, the only thing I could hear. When I reached the top, I took cover behind a massive, lightning-scarred cedar and looked back. Below me, the forest was a sea of dark green, broken only by the gray spines of dead trees. I scanned the area where I had camped, my eyes searching for any flash of white, any movement that didn't belong to the wind. For several minutes, I saw nothing. Then, near a cluster of boulders half a mile back, I saw a flicker of movement. It was a flash of dull, dirty white. Then another. They were moving through the trees with an unnerving fluidity, not following the path I had taken, but parallel to it. They weren't tracking my footprints. They were tracking me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They knew exactly where I was going. They were herding me, pushing me deeper into the wilderness, away from the main trail and the potential safety of other hikers. I looked at my map, the paper crinkling in my sweat-slicked hands. I was miles from the nearest road, and the trail ahead dipped into a deep, shadows-filled canyon that remained dark even in the middle of the day. I had to make a choice. I could try to double back and reach the trail, but that would mean walking directly toward them. Or I could keep moving forward, hoping to outpace them through the rough terrain. I chose to move. I spent the afternoon navigating a series of narrow ledges, the drop-off to my left a dizzying plunge into a rocky ravine. The air was getting colder as the sun moved west, and a thin, biting mist began to roll in from the higher peaks. By 4 in the afternoon, the mist had turned into a thick, gray fog that swallowed the trees and muffled all sound. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Every tree looked like a person. Every shadow looked like a figure in white. I stopped to check my compass, but the needle spun erratically, likely due to the high iron content in the volcanic rock. I was lost, exhausted, and the temperature was dropping fast. As I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, I heard a sound that made my heart stop. It was the sound of a whistle. It was a long, low note that started flat and ended in a sharp, rising trill. It was followed immediately by a second whistle, further away, to my right. They were communicating. They were closing the gap in the fog. The fog was no longer a weather pattern. It was a physical presence, a cold, wet shroud that clung to my skin and tasted of wet stone and ancient rot. I moved through it like a ghost, every step deliberate, every breath a shallow, controlled effort to remain silent. The whistles continued, a rhythmic exchange that seemed to bounce off the invisible walls of the vapor. One would sound high and sharp to my left, only to be answered by a low, mournful tone from somewhere behind me. They were using the geography of the fog to triangulate my position, whispering to one another across the gray void. I found myself in a stand of ancient, stunted hemlocks, their branches draped in long, weeping tresses of pale green lichen. The trees looked like skeletal figures frozen in mid-reach, and as I brushed past them, the lichen felt like damp hair against my face. I pushed deeper into the grove, the ground beneath my feet turning from hard volcanic soil to a thick, spongy carpet of moss that swallowed the sound of my boots. It was a relief to move silently, but the lack of noise only amplified the sounds coming from the fog. I heard the sound of a heavy object being dragged across the earth. It was a wet, sliding noise, the sound of something large and limp being pulled through the muck. It stopped, then started again, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic grunting of someone exerting immense physical force. I pressed my back against the trunk of a hemlock, the rough bark biting into my shoulder blades. The sound was close, perhaps 20 feet away, but in the whiteout of the mist, it could have been 5. The grunting stopped, replaced by the sound of a metallic rasp. It was the sound of a blade being run over a whetstone, a steady, rhythmic scraping that set my teeth on edge. The vibration of the metal seemed to travel through the very air, a cold, sharpening sound that promised a violent end. I realized then that they weren't just following me anymore, they were preparing. They were setting the stage for whatever was to come. I dropped to my hands and knees, the cold dampness of the moss soaking into my trousers. I began to crawl, feeling my way forward with my fingers. I couldn't trust my eyes, so I relied on the texture of the ground. I felt for the slope of the land, hoping to find a downward incline that might lead to a creek or a drainage pipe. If I could find running water, I could follow it out of the forest. After what felt like an hour of agonizingly slow movement, my hand plunged into nothingness. I lunged back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was at the edge of a ravine. I reached out and felt the cold, smooth surface of a rock face that dropped away into a black abyss. I listened, and far below, I heard the faint, muffled roar of water. It was a mountain stream swollen by the recent snowmelt. I began to edge along the rim of the ravine, searching for a way down. The fog seemed to thin slightly near the edge, revealing the jagged, broken teeth of the cliffside. I found a narrow chute, a steep gully filled with loose dirt and small stones. It was dangerous. A slip could mean a broken limb or worse, but staying on the ridge was certain death. I began the descent, sliding on my backside, my boots kicking up small avalanches of scree that sounded like thunder in the muffled quiet. I grabbed at the roots of scrub bushes to slow my progress, the thorns tearing at my palms. Halfway down, the chute ended in a sheer drop of about 10 feet. I hesitated, looking back up into the fog. Above me, silhouetted against the gray curtain of the mist, stood a figure. It was the man. He was standing perfectly still at the edge of the chute, looking down toward me. He didn't have a flashlight. He didn't have a weapon in his hand. He was just standing there, his long, matted beard white with the moisture of the fog. He looked less like a man and more like a part of the mountain itself, a weathered, jagged outcropping of bone and gristle. He didn't shout. He didn't jump. He just watched me with that same flat, empty stare. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I pushed off the ledge and dropped into the darkness. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth and sending a flare of white-hot pain through my right ankle. I rolled into the icy water of the stream, the shock of the cold stealing my breath. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throb in my leg, and began to wade downstream. The water was shallow, barely reaching my knees, but the current was strong. The stones beneath my feet were slick with algae, making every step a gamble. I moved as fast as I dared, the sound of the rushing water masking my movements. I looked back and saw the faint, flickering glow of a lantern appearing at the top of the chute I had just ascended. The light swung back and forth, a predatory eye searching the floor of the ravine. The ravine narrowed until the rock walls were close enough to touch on either side. The air here was even colder, trapped in the stone throat of the mountain. I found a small alcove, a shallow cave carved into the cliffside by centuries of erosion. I crawled inside, tucking my body into the smallest possible space. I pulled my pack in front of me, creating a makeshift barricade. I sat there in the dark, the sound of the stream a constant rushing roar in my ears. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my knife. The weight of it, the only thing keeping me from shattering into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated terror. I was trapped in a stone box, cold, injured, and hunted by people who didn't speak a language I knew, who moved through the wilderness like they owned every shadow and every breath of wind. Hours passed. The cold began to settle into my bones, a deep, aching chill that made my muscles twitch uncontrollably. I fought the urge to shiver, knowing that any vibration could be felt by a sensitive ear. The fog outside the alcove began to change color, turning from a dull gray to a deep, bruised purple as the last of the light faded from the sky. Then, above the sound of the water, I heard a new noise. It was a rhythmic tapping coming from the rock wall directly above my head. It was slow and steady, the sound of a stone being struck against stone. Tap, tap, tap. It was a signal. A moment later, something small and heavy fell from the ledge above and landed in the water just a few feet from the mouth of my cave. I leaned forward, my eyes straining to see in the gloom. It was a bundle of something, wrapped in a piece of dirty white cloth. The current caught it, swirling it around before it snagged on a rock. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pulled the bundle toward me. The cloth was rough and smelled of wood smoke and something sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit. I unwrapped it slowly, my heart a lead weight in my chest. Inside the cloth was my missing food bag. It had been opened and the contents removed. In their place was a collection of bird skulls, their delicate paper-thin bones bleached white and arranged in a perfect concentric circle. And in the very center of the circle was a single human tooth, stained yellow and cracked down the middle. I stared at the tooth for a long time, the yellowed ivory gleaming like a sick moon in the center of that macabre arrangement. The internal logic of my world had finally fractured. This was no longer a simple theft or a case of territorial hikers. This was a ritual. This was a message written in the language of bone, a declaration that I was no longer a visitor in these woods, but a piece of the ecosystem they intended to harvest. The sweet, cloying scent of the cloth filled the small alcove, a smell that reminded me of overripe peaches left to blacken in the sun, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. The tapping on the rock above me stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise, a heavy vacuum that seemed to suck the very air out of my lungs. I knew they were still there, perched on the ledge like gargoyles, waiting for the psychological weight of their gift to crush my resolve. I felt a hysterical urge to laugh, a bubbling, jagged sound rising in my chest that I had to choke back until my ribs ached. They wanted me to know that they could touch me whenever they pleased. They had entered my space, handled my belongings, and replaced my sustenance with the remains of the dead. I realized then that I could not stay in the alcove. To stay was to wait for the inevitable moment they decided to reach down and pull me out. I had to move, but the stream was a treacherous path. I looked at my ankle, which had swollen into a tight, angry knot of heat. I used the dirty white cloth to tie a makeshift compression wrap, the fabric feeling greasy against my skin. Every movement was a battle against the instinct to curl into a ball and vanish. I edged out of the cave, the icy water of the stream immediately numbing my feet. I moved downstream, keeping my body low, my left hand skimming the wet stone of the ravine wall for balance. The darkness was absolute now, the kind of darkness that felt like a solid object pressing against my eyes. I navigated by the vibration of the water against my legs and the distant, muffled roar of the current ahead. The ravine began to widen, the steep walls giving way to a more gradual slope, thick with the skeletal remains of a cedar forest that had burned years ago. The charred trunks stood like blackened pillars against the purple sky, their branches reaching out like charred fingers. I climbed out of the water, my boots squelching with a heavy, rhythmic suction that felt dangerously loud. I needed to find the trail again, or at least a high point where I could orient myself by the stars if the fog would ever truly break. As I ascended the slope, the smell of wood smoke returned, but this time it was fresh and sharp. It wasn't the scent of a controlled campfire. It was the smell of something burning hot and fast. I crested a small rise and froze. About 100 yards away, a fire was roaring in the center of a wide, flat clearing. It wasn't built for warmth or cooking. It was a massive, chaotic pyre of brush and logs, the flames licking 20 feet into the air, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched toward me like reaching arms. The two figures were there. They were moving around the fire with a frantic, jerky energy. The woman was swaying, her arms wrapped around her own torso, while the man was feeding the flames with armloads of dry pine. They weren't speaking, but they were making a sound, a collective, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. It was a sound of communal hunger, a drone that seemed to synchronize with the crackle of the burning wood. I watched as the man reached into a large, hide-bound sack at his feet. He pulled out something dark and heavy and tossed it into the center of the fire. The flames turned a brilliant, sickly green for a few seconds, and a thick, oily smoke billowed upward, smelling of burnt hair and sulfur. The woman began to spin, her white rags fluttering like the wings of a moth caught in a jar. Her movements were not graceful. They were a series of controlled collapses, a mockery of a dance that made my stomach turn. I stayed in the shadows of the burnt cedars, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I realized that the trail was on the other side of that clearing. They had positioned themselves directly in my path, using the light of the fire to create a perimeter I could not cross unseen. I was being funneled toward them. Every choice I had made, every turn I had taken in the fog had led me exactly where they wanted me to be. I looked down at my knife, the blade reflecting the distant orange glow. It felt small and pathetic against the primal power of the scene before me. I wasn't just facing two people, I was facing a madness that had been nurtured in the deep, dark places of the mountain, a fever that had boiled over and now required a witness. The woman stopped spinning. She turned her head toward the trees where I was hiding, her movements slow and mechanical. She didn't have a flashlight, but the firelight caught her eyes, reflecting back a dull, predatory gold. She raised a hand and pointed a long, dirt-stained finger directly at my shadow. The humming stopped. The man dropped the branch he was holding. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't scream. He simply began to walk toward me, his gait a heavy, purposeful shuffle that ignored the uneven ground and the sharp rocks. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew the chase was coming to an end. I backed away, my bad ankle screaming in protest as I retreated into the blackened forest. I didn't look back, but I could hear the sound of his footsteps, a heavy thud, thud, thud that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He knew the terrain, and he knew my exhaustion. I tripped over a fallen log, the charred wood crumbling under my weight and coating my clothes in a fine, black soot. I scrambled up, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped my knife. I ran blindly into the dark, the branches of the dead trees catching on my pack and scratching at my neck. I could hear the woman start to whistle again, that same rising and falling tone that I had heard in the fog. It was a signal of the hunt, a song of the harvest. I realized that I couldn't outrun them on the slope. I needed to find a place to hide, a place where I could turn the darkness into my own weapon. I found a small depression in the earth, a natural hollow beneath the roots of a massive toppled fir. I slid into it, pulling the loose dirt and dead needles over my body until I was almost completely submerged. I held my breath, the taste of the earth filling my mouth, and listened. The footsteps grew louder. They stopped just a few feet from my hiding place. I could hear the man's heavy, wet breathing, a sound like a bellows being worked in the dark. I could smell him now, a scent of old sweat, wood smoke, and that same cloying, rotten peach smell that had been on the cloth. He was standing right above me. I gripped the knife and prepared to strike, my entire existence reduced to the single, terrifying moment of the next heartbeat. The weight of the man's presence was a physical pressure, a heavy, airless vacuum that seemed to draw the very warmth from the soil around me. I lay in the hollow, the damp earth pressing against my chest, feeling the grit of the volcanic dust between my teeth. I was buried alive by choice, a frantic attempt to become a ghost before he could make me one. Above me, the man's breathing was a rhythmic, wet rasping, the sound of air struggling through a throat lined with phlegm and age. He did not move for a long time. He simply stood there, a dark monolith against the flickering orange haze of the distant fire. I could hear the minute sounds of his body, the subtle creak of leather, the rustle of his stained white garments, and a soft, wet clicking sound he made with his tongue against the roof of his mouth. It was an inquisitive sound, like a predator tasting the air for the scent of fear. My own heart felt like a trapped animal, drumming a frantic, irregular beat against the floor of the hollow. I was certain he could hear it. I was certain the vibration of my pulse was telegraphing my location through the roots of the fir tree. Then I felt a shift in the ground. The man knelt. The sound of his knees hitting the dry needles was a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hand white-knuckled around the hilt of my knife. A long, thin object began to poke into the loose debris covering me. It was a stick, or perhaps a finger, probing the earth with a slow, clinical curiosity. It brushed against the fabric of my jacket, a sensation that sent a jolt of pure electric terror through my spine. I did not flinch. I turned my mind into a cold, flat stone, pushing every thought, every memory, and every spark of humanity into a dark corner of my consciousness. The probing stopped. I heard him let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound that carried a strange, heavy disappointment. He stood up, his joints popping with the sound of dry twigs breaking. His footsteps began to move away, but they were not retreating. He was pacing a wide, slow circle around the toppled tree, his movements heavy and deliberate. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the silence and the dark to do the work that his hands had not yet finished. From the direction of the fire, the woman's voice rose in a high, wavering keen. It was a sound stripped of all linguistic meaning, a primal lament that echoed off the rock walls of the canyon. It was a call, a signal that the fire was reaching its zenith and the time for the gathering had come. The man stopped his pacing. I heard him move toward the fire, his footsteps fading into the soft crunch of the charred forest floor. I waited. I counted my breaths, reaching 100, then 500, then 1,000. The cold had moved beyond an ache, turning into a dull, leaden numbness that made my limbs feel like they belonged to someone else. I finally dared to open my eyes. The world was a blur of black and deep violet. I slowly, agonizingly, began to push myself out of the earth. My joints screamed in protest, and my swollen ankle throbbed with a rhythmic, hot intensity that made my vision swim. I rose from the hollow like a corpse being unburied, shaking the dirt from my hair and clothes. The fire was still burning, but it had settled into a deep, glowing red eye in the center of the clearing. The silhouettes of the man and woman were visible, sitting motionless by the embers, their backs to me. They looked like statues carved from salt, white and brittle in the dying light. I knew I couldn't stay on the ridge. I had to find a way to circumvent the clearing and find the trail that led toward the northern pass. I began to move laterally, staying deep within the shadows of the burnt timber. The ground was a minefield of fallen branches and loose rock. Every step was a calculated risk. I used the blackened trunks as cover, moving from one to the next, my eyes never leaving the two figures by the fire. As I moved, I noticed something hanging from the low branches of the trees. At first, I thought they were clusters of dried pine needles or perhaps moss. But as I drew closer, the scent reached me again, that cloying, sweet rot. They were small bundles of hair, bound together with strips of the same white cloth the couple wore. Some of the bundles contained small, delicate bones, while others held dried flowers or pieces of rusted metal. They were hung at regular intervals, creating a perimeter of charms that seemed to vibrate with a low, discordant energy. I realized then that I wasn't just in their hunting ground, I was in their cathedral. The entire forest had been mapped out and sanctified by their madness. The bundles of hair moved slightly in the cold night wind, brushing against one another with a dry, whispering sound. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I pushed forward, my breath coming in short, shallow hitches. I reached a point where the slope dropped away into a narrow, rocky chimney. If I could navigate down this crevice, I would bypass the clearing entirely and come out on the lower bench where the Pacific Crest Trail resumed its northward trek. I began the descent, my fingers searching for handholds in the cold, slick basalt. The rock was unforgiving, tearing at my skin, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the psychological weight of the hunt. Halfway down the chimney, I heard a sound from above. It was a soft, rhythmic sliding, the sound of fabric on stone. I looked up, my neck straining. At the top of the crevice, a pale face peered down at me. It was the woman. The firelight was far behind her now, leaving her face in shadow, but I could see the glint of her teeth. She wasn't screaming, she was smiling. It was a wide, vacant expression that didn't reach her eyes, a mimicry of human emotion that felt more terrifying than any snarl. She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a handful of something dark. She began to rain it down upon me. It was ash. A fine gray powder that coated my head and shoulders, stinging my eyes and filling my nostrils with the scent of the pyre. She began to hum again, that same tuneless, repetitive drone, her voice echoing in the narrow confines of the rock chimney. I scrambled down the last few feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and tumbled onto the flat ground of the lower bench. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran until the sound of her humming was swallowed by the wind, until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. And until the red eye of the fire was nothing more than a memory in the dark. I was back on the trail, the narrow ribbon of dirt visible in the starlight, but the forest no longer felt like a path to safety. It felt like a trap that had finally, mercifully, failed to snap shut. But the night was far from over. The trail beneath my feet was no longer a path of progress. It was a treadmill of survival. My boots struck the hard-packed earth with a rhythmic, hollow thud that echoed through the dark cathedral of the pines. Every muscle in my body was locked in a state of tectonic tension, vibrating with a frequency that felt like it might shatter my bones. The ash the woman had rained down upon me had mixed with my sweat, forming a gray, gritty paste that smeared across my forehead and stung the corners of my eyes. It was a mark, a visual brand that signaled I had been touched by their world. I pushed my body into a grueling, mechanical pace. My right ankle, once a sharp source of agony, had transitioned into a dull, throbbing weight. A heavy anchor I was forced to drag through the miles. The forest around me was a blur of vertical lines, the trees standing like the bars of a cage that stretched on for eternity. The air was getting thinner as the trail ascended toward a high, exposed ridge, and each breath felt like a shallow sip of ice water. I didn't dare turn on my headlamp. To do so would be to light a beacon in the void, inviting whatever lived in the shadows to close the distance. The psychological decay was beginning to take root. In the absolute darkness, my mind began to play cruel tricks on the architecture of the woods. I would see a fallen log, and my heart would leap into my throat, convinced it was the man crouched in wait. I would hear the snap of a cooling rock, and be certain it was the sound of a rifle being cocked. The silence was an adversary, a heavy, velvet curtain that muffled the sounds I needed to hear while amplifying the internal roar of my own panic. I began to talk to myself, not in words, but in a low, frantic internal monologue, a desperate attempt to maintain a tether to my own identity. I recited the names of streets in my hometown, the ingredients of my favorite meal, the names of people I feared I would never see again. About 3 hours into this frantic marathon, the terrain changed. The dense forest gave way to a vast, open field of ancient lava flow. The ground was a jagged, obsidian sea, frozen in a state of violent upheaval. There were no trees here, only the low, stunted shapes of manzanita bushes that looked like huddling figures in the starlight. The wind picked up, a high, whistling gale that whipped across the exposed rock and carried with it a new scent. It wasn't the sweet rot of the charms or the sulfur of the fire. It was the smell of iron. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning my weight against a waist-high pillar of volcanic rock. The silence here was different. It was vast and hollow. I looked back over my shoulder, scanning the trail I had just traversed. Far below, in the dark valley I had escaped, I saw a single, tiny spark. It was moving. It wasn't the steady glow of a flashlight. It was the erratic, jumping flicker of a torch. They were still coming. They were moving across the landscape with a terrifying, inhuman persistence, a slow-motion pursuit that didn't care for the limits of the human heart. The spark was joined by a second one. They were far apart, moving in a pincer movement, cutting across the switchbacks of the trail to intercept me at the next ridge. I felt a cold, oily wave of despair. I had run for miles, pushing myself to the brink of physical collapse, and they had simply adjusted their pace to match mine. They were not tired. They were not cold. They were fueled by a singular, obsessive purpose that defied the laws of biology. I began to move again, my legs feeling like heavy columns of lead. The lava field was a nightmare to navigate in the dark. The obsidian was sharp as glass, catching at the soles of my boots and tearing at the fabric of my trousers. I fell frequently, my hands striking the cold, abrasive stone, the skin of my palms beginning to weep a slow, sticky warmth. I didn't feel the pain anymore. I only felt the proximity of the sparks behind me. As I reached the far edge of the lava field, I found myself standing at the base of a massive, sheer rock face. The trail narrowed into a precarious ledge, barely 2 feet wide, that hugged the side of the cliff. To my left was the stone wall. To my right was a vertical drop into a black canyon that seemed to descend into the very bowels of the earth. I pressed my chest against the cold rock, my fingers searching for handholds in the cracks of the basalt. I shuffled sideways, the wind trying to pull me off the ledge and into the void. Halfway across the cliff, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was coming from the rock itself, a low, rhythmic vibration, like the purring of a giant cat. I pressed my ear to the stone, and the sound became a series of distinct, metallic taps. Someone was on the other side of the cliff, or perhaps above me, striking the rock with a rhythmic intensity. Tap, 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 tap. It was the same cadence I had heard in the cave. They were signaling my progress to one another, using the mountain as a sounding board. The realization that they were above me sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my veins. I looked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw a silhouette pass across the stars. It was a shape that was too long, too fluid to be human, a shadow that seemed to stretch and contract as it moved along the rim of the canyon. A small stone tumbled down from above, bouncing off my shoulder before disappearing into the darkness below. I reached the end of the ledge and tumbled onto a small, flat plateau. My breath was a ragged, whistling sound that filled the air. I looked ahead and saw a small, dilapidated structure. It was an old fire lookout, a skeleton of wood and rusted tin perched on the very edge of the ridge. It was a ruin, a ghost of a building, but it had a door. It had walls. I scrambled toward it, my boots slipping on the frosted grass. I reached the door and threw my weight against it. It groaned on its rusted hinges, a sound like a dying animal, and swung open. I ducked inside and slammed the door shut, sliding a heavy, rotting wooden beam across the frame. I collapsed against the wall, the darkness of the interior feeling like a heavy blanket. For the first time in hours, I was out of the wind. I sat there, gasping for air, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. And then, in the corner of the room, I heard a soft, wet sound. It was the sound of someone breathing, not the heavy, wet rasp of the man, and not the high-pitched hum of the woman. It was a soft, rhythmic intake of air, followed by a low, contented sob. The interior of the fire lookout was a confined box of stagnant air and decaying timber. The sob I heard was not a sound of grief, but a thin, oscillating tremor of pure exhaustion, a sound that seemed to leak out of the shadows in the far corner. I did not turn on my light. I did not move. I simply sat with my back against the door, the cold wood pressing into my spine, and watched the darkness. Gradually, as my eyes adjusted to the lack of light, a shape began to resolve itself. It was a person, huddled into a tight, fetal ball, their knees pulled up to their chin. As I watched, the figure shifted and the smell of the room changed. It was the scent of terror, sharp, acidic, and overwhelming. I realized then that I was not alone with an enemy, but with another victim. I reached out a hand, my fingers brushing against the rough, cold fabric of a nylon jacket. The person flinched, a violent, full-body spasm that made the floorboards groan, but they did not scream. We sat there in the dark, two ghosts sharing a tomb, while the wind outside began to howl with a renewed, predatory vigor. I could hear the metallic rattling of the tin roof, a sound like 1,000 tiny hammers striking the building. Through the gaps in the rotting walls, I saw the flicker of the torches again. They were circling the lookout. I could see the orange light bleeding through the cracks, casting long, vibrating bars of amber across the floor. The couple was not rushing the door. They were simply there, marking the perimeter, letting the firelight announce their presence. The person in the corner began to speak, but it was not a conversation. It was a frantic, whispered litany of facts. They spoke of the days they had been running, the way the woman had appeared in the middle of the trail like a mirage, and the way the man had stood outside their tent, just watching. The voice was hollow, stripped of all timbre and life, sounding more like the wind through a dead tree than a human throat. They told me about the others, the people who hadn't made it to the lookout, the ones whose gear had been found scattered like autumn leaves across the lava fields. I listened to the vibration of the voice, feeling the hopelessness of it settle into my own bones. The stranger reached out and touched my arm, their hand like a claw of ice. They told me that the couple wasn't looking for food or money. They were looking for witnesses. They wanted us to see what the mountain had made of them, to carry the infection of their madness back into the world, or to become part of the mountain ourselves. The rattling of the roof suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, airless void that made my ears ache. Then, a sound began beneath the floorboards. It was a scratching, a slow, methodical rasping of fingernails against the underside of the wood. It moved from the center of the room toward the corner where the stranger sat. I could hear the grit being displaced, the sound of wood fibers being pulled apart by a patient, relentless force. The person beside me began to whimper, a high, thin sound that vibrated through my own arm. I gripped my knife, the handle slick with my own sweat. I felt a sudden, violent urge to scream, to break the tension with a burst of noise, but my throat was a dry, constricted knot. The scratching stopped directly beneath the stranger. A second later, a single, pale finger poked through a hole in the rotting floor. It was a long, yellowed digit, the nail caked with dark earth. It moved with a slow, exploratory grace, brushing against the stranger's boot. The reaction was instantaneous. The stranger bolted, throwing themselves toward the opposite wall with a cry of pure, unadulterated primal fear. In their panic, they struck the rotting support beam of the lookout. The building shivered. The tin roof let out a deafening shriek of protesting metal, and the door I was leaning against buckled outward. I scrambled to my feet, my ankle screaming in protest, and looked through the gap in the doorway. The man was standing there. He wasn't holding a torch anymore. He was holding a length of the same white cloth, stretched tight between his hands. The firelight from the torches he had planted in the ground behind him made him look like a giant, his shadow stretching across the plateau until it swallowed the lookout whole. The woman appeared on the roof. I could hear her feet scurrying across the tin, a sound like a frantic animal. She leaned over the edge, her hair hanging down like a curtain of gray moss, her eyes fixed on mine. She began to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that had no joy in it, a sound that was simply a release of pressure. I looked at the stranger, who was now huddled against the far window, staring at the man in the doorway. I realized that if we stayed here, we were trapped in a cage of our own making. I reached out and grabbed the stranger's collar, hauling them toward the door. I didn't have a plan. I only had the instinct to move, to stay in motion until the heart stopped or the sun rose. We burst through the door together, a tangled mess of limbs and panic. The man stepped back, surprised by the sudden violence of our exit. I didn't look at his face. I didn't look at the cloth in his hands. I just ran toward the edge of the plateau, where the trail dipped into a dense, dark stand of hemlocks. Behind us, the woman let out a piercing, high-frequency shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound of fury, a sound of the hunt being interrupted. I could hear them both behind us now, their footsteps a frantic, rhythmic drumming on the hard earth. We plunged into the trees, the darkness swallowing us instantly. The forest here was different. It felt old, heavy with the weight of centuries. The trees were so thick that the starlight couldn't penetrate the canopy. We moved by touch and instinct, our hands raking against the bark, our feet stumbling over roots. The stranger was gasping, a wet, rattling sound that told me they were reaching their limit. I pushed them forward, my own body a machine of pure, unthinking survival. We reached a small clearing where a mountain spring bubbled out of the rock. The water was black and mirrored the stars that peeked through the branches. I stopped for a second, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked back and saw two pale shapes moving through the trees, their white garments glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. They weren't running anymore. They were gliding, their movements synchronized and silent. They had found the rhythm of the woods again, and they were closing the gap with every silent step. The cold had become a permanent part of my internal geography. My lungs felt like they had been lined with frost, and every breath was a jagged, crystalline effort that scraped against the back of my throat. Beside me, the stranger was little more than a collection of frantic, wet sounds and a heavy, trembling pressure against my shoulder. We stood by the mountain spring, the water bubbling with a low, mocking chuckle as it spilled over the black rocks. The The two shapes in white were no longer rushing. They were simply occupying the space between the trees, drifting closer with the agonizing slowness of a rising tide. I looked at my hands, the skin stained with obsidian dust, dried blood, and the gray ash of the woman's fire. I realized that the man and woman were no longer the only predators in these woods. To survive, I had been forced to adopt their rhythm, their silence, and their cold, singular focus. The mountain had stripped away the thin veneer of the person I used to be, leaving behind something raw, sharpened, and unrecognizable. I gripped my knife one last time, feeling the vibration of the mountain in the steel, and then I turned to the stranger. I didn't use words. I simply pointed toward the northern horizon, where the very first hint of a bruised, pre-dawn gray was beginning to bleed into the sky. We ran. Not with the frantic energy of the night before, but with a heavy, terminal desperation. We climbed the final ridge, our fingers digging into the frozen earth, pulling ourselves upward as the two figures followed with an eerie, effortless grace. They did not shout. They did not call out. They simply remained at the edge of our vision, a constant pale reminder that we were being allowed to leave, provided we carried the weight of what we had seen. As the sun finally crested the distant peaks, spilling a harsh gold light across the Lassen Forest, the shadows began to shrink. The transition was violent. The world of the night, with its bone charms and ritual fires, seemed to evaporate under the scrutiny of the day. When I reached the high pass and looked back, the forest looked indifferent. It was just a sea of green and gray, a vast, silent expanse of timber and stone. The figures were gone. There were no white rags fluttering in the wind, no rhythmic whistling, and no smell of rotting peaches. There was only the wind, cold and clean, blowing down from the glaciers. I eventually reached a trailhead where a Forest Service truck was parked. The transition back to humanity was jarring. The sound of a gasoline engine felt like an assault on my senses. The sight of a man in a clean uniform drinking coffee from a thermos felt like a hallucination. I didn't tell him everything. How could I? I couldn't explain the way the man's breathing felt like a physical weight on my chest, or the way the woman's laughter had sounded like the breaking of dry wings. I simply told him I had gotten lost, that I had been spooked by the isolation. He looked at my face, at the ash smeared into my pores and the hollow, haunted look in my eyes, and he didn't ask any more questions. He just gave me a blanket and a ride to the nearest town. The stranger I had found in the lookout disappeared into the bureaucracy of a local hospital, and I never saw them again. I think we both understood that our bond was forged in a place that didn't belong to the world of names and addresses. We were two people who had looked into the same abyss, and the only thing we owed each other was silence. Now, years later, I am far from the Pacific Crest Trail. I live in a city filled with the hum of electricity and the constant, comforting presence of other people. But the mountain has never truly let go of me. I find myself waking up at 3 in the morning, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced that I can hear the sound of a dry branch snapping outside my window. I find myself checking the ground for white stones, and I never, ever leaves my food where it can be reached by anything with hands. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in from the coast, I can smell it. That sweet, cloying scent of overripe fruit and old wood smoke. I look into the gray vapor and I see the flicker of a white garment. I know they are still out there, in the high, thin air of the Cascades, tending to their fires and hanging their bundles of hair from the hemlock branches. They are a part of the landscape now, as permanent as the lava flows and the ancient cedars. They are the guardians of a madness that only the truly isolated can understand. I often think about the man's eyes, those dark, empty pits that held no malice, only a profound and terrifying emptiness. He wasn't a monster in the way we think of them in stories. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the silence until there was nothing left but the hunger of the earth itself. And I know with a cold certainty that keeps me awake at night that a piece of that emptiness came home with me. I am a witness now. I am the vessel for their story, a living charm hung on the branch of civilization to remind us that the wilderness is not a park, it is a presence, it is a mouth. And it is always, always waiting for someone to wander just a little too far from the path. The trail is still there, a ribbon of dirt beckoning to the restless and the brave. People still set out every summer, filled with dreams of immortality and the beauty of the wild. They pack their bags, they lace their boots, and they head into the trees. I want to warn them. I want to tell them that the silence isn't empty, and the shadows aren't just a lack of light, but I know they wouldn't listen. I wouldn't have listened. So, I sit in my well-lit room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and I wait for the fog to clear. Because deep down, in the part of me that still tastes of ash and obsidian, I know that the hunt never truly ends. It just waits for the next set of footprints to appear in the dust,